When I was about 12, my dad decided to go to Holland with my grandmother and other family members. My mother and 2 siblings and I stayed home. I'm the middle child, but I'm the oldest boy. With my dad being gone, I had to do the chores. It was winter and I live on a farm, so I had to tend to the animals. Since it gets cold in the night, the animal water freezes. We raise 2 beef each year for meat. I got up at 4, as I had to do the whole time my father was gone, 'cause I had school. I got dressed and headed outside. This was my 5th day or so of doing this. It was still dark out. There was a clear sky allowing me to see the moon and stars through the trees. I could see me breathe as I walked to the barn. I noticed that it was unusually quiet. Normally, the cows moo at me when they hear or see me. I walked into the barn and fed them their grain and alfalfa hay. I went over and broke the ice in their water trough. I fed the 3 cats we had at the time. Only one is around today. I then went around the back of our barn to look at the moon. Sky was just starting to show signs of approaching morning. All of a sudden, the cows flew out of the barn and ran straight through the damp fence. They continued running into the pasture along the creek. I then saw this 6 to 7 foot tall creature run the same direction but along the creek in the opposite direction. It made its way into the woods in a matter of seconds. Once it was in the woods, I could kind of smell a nasty smell, but maybe it was just the cows or something. I mean, I was right behind the barn. One thing that is crazy about it is that it was almost completely silent. The only time it made noise is when I stepped into the puddles along the creek. I began walking back to the house when I realized there was something in the barn. I slowly snuck over. I looked through the crack in the door, and I couldn't believe my eyes. This thing was eating the corn out of the cow's grain. One by one, every grain of it. He then looked towards the door and stood up. He looked around. He then grabbed a brick my daddy uses to hold the tarp down over our grain, because our barn leaks, and threw it towards the door where I was at. I jumped and started to shake. I was in such disbelief that I actually hit myself in the head, hoping I was hallucinating. I could feel the adrenaline in me rushing like crazy. I decided to peek again. I looked through the crack, but everything was dark. I soon realized that I was looking this ugly bitch in the face. I scooped gravel off the ground and flung it in the crack and ran. I turned and looked at the barn. This thing jumped out the window on the side and ran towards me. It jumped the fence and was gaining fast. I ran to the house and the damn door was locked. I ran to the garage and it was open. I managed to get in and I waited there for about 5 minutes. I slowly opened the door to peek. Our garage was separate from our house, so I had to do a big 10-stride run to the back door. I sprinted and made it inside, thanking God that the door was unlocked. I looked out the window and turned the garage light on. I about died when I realized it was only 10 feet away. I didn't tell anyone, because I didn't think they would believe me. I've only told my sister, and the only reason I told her was because within the last year, she started going in the woods. She has found footprints. She has also had glimpses of them. I never let her go alone anymore. Whatever I saw, I'm sure is a Bigfoot. If the natives have any cave carvings and paintings of them, and including many legends, then why can't they exist? I don't believe, I know. We find in the same paintings the saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth. My story starts as me and my cousin were home alone on a warm summer's day. She and I were sitting on the living room floor, sewing, because that was the only interesting thing we could do that day. We had a fan and an open window, as it gets really hot in Mount Shasta during the summer. The fan was blowing cool air into the overheated house. I could remember that it was not a windy day whatsoever. Remember this detail, because it is very important throughout the story. Me and my cousin were just sitting there having a conversation about something that I can't specifically remember, when all of a sudden, the fan falls out of the window. It was one of those box-like fans that, if I think about it now, even if it was wind, I don't think it would have been strong enough to knock it over. Me and my cousin did think it was a wind at first, so we put the fan back up and continued sewing. Not that long after, I heard a crash and looked up to see the fan had fallen over by itself again. Once again, we chalked it up to the wind and put it back up. But then it happened again. Then again. We started getting a little skeptical and went to see if it was the wind, but there was no wind or nothing. It was a nice, really hot summer's day. Right after that, all of a sudden, all the doors inside the house started opening and closing constantly. We knew for a fact this was not the wind, as even the doors in the outside of the house were opening, like the bedroom doors, the laundry room door, the front door, and the garage door, etc. We got a little spooked out, so my cousin ended up calling her ex-boyfriend's mum, who, according to my cousin, was a spiritual person who knew about this kind of stuff. This lady ended up answering the phone, and we quickly explained to her what was happening. She told us that we had to go find a Bible. I obediently went into my grandparents' room because I knew they had a few different Bibles in their closet. Once we got the Bible, the lady on the phone told us that we had to open it to a random page, then join hands. We joined hands, then the lady told us to repeat after her. She then started saying some type of prayer that I had never heard before. We did as she asked and repeated the prayer. The doors started opening and closing faster and more violently as we kept saying the prayer. Then all of a sudden, the strangest thing ended up happening. The second we said the final word of the prayer, everything just stopped. Got quiet. Everything went back to normal. This event has impacted me in quite a few different ways. I started becoming way more interested in all things paranormal and supernatural. I researched and found out all the information I could on all things paranormal. From all the research I have done, I have concluded that what was in that house was something called a poltergeist. A poltergeist is a type of ghost that is able to move or throw things, and is also capable of making really loud noises. This is the only type of ghost I could figure out that can move all those doors. I have since been back to the house, but also with equipment I have rather made or purchased online. I have also experienced other things from doing this type of stuff. I think this experience will impact my life forever. My name is Matthew, and I'm a hardcore biker. I own a GSXR motorcycle, a pretty fast bike in case you didn't know. I live in Grand Lagoon, Trinidad. Today was my second cousin's birthday, and my other cousins and I kept a little get-together for him. My encounter started when I left my home around midnight to get some snacks, as the ones we had gotten before had been dissipated. The closest mini-mart was located out of town, about 2.5-hour drive under the speed limit. but being a biker, I loved speed. As I was about half a mile outside of town, driving on about 100 miles per hour, I accidentally hit the kill switch on the bike and it came off. I cautiously pulled over to the side of the road and hopped off. I then laughed at myself for making such a rookie mistake. It took me a few minutes after laughing at myself to realize something really odd. The entire area was completely quiet. Not just any kind of quiet. The type of quiet that makes a ringing sound in your ear. I stood there looking around, contributing to the surrounding quietness, but it was everywhere. Nothing was out tonight. Usually, you hear common bugs, like crickets and so on, but there was nothing. Memory soon kicked in, as I remembered overhearing my dad and his friend's conversation on hunting. His friend said, "Always remember when out there, if the woods get quiet, be cautious. It means there's a predator around." I quickly got quiet and paced myself and walked back to the bike feeling rather threatened. There was nothing here. I hopped on my bike and turned the key, watching my dashboard light up, and that's when I heard it. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the road in front of me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as chills ran down my spine, signaling for me to get out of there. I stood there paralyzed with fear as my body denied the signals from my brain, and at that moment came a low growl. I stood there, overthinking what to do, as it growled once more. I quickly snapped out of it and pushed the start button on the bike and turned the headlights on. That was the biggest mistake of my life, because the sight that presented itself to me could never be unseen. 15 feet in front of me stood this thing. I'm saying thing because I've never seen anything like it before. Nothing on this earth resembles this. And I would consider myself an Animal Planet freak. It stood on its hind legs, about 7 feet tall, with pale white skin and yellowish eyes. And at first, I thought it could have been a bear. But there are no bears where I'm from. Its arms and legs were elongated and weird looking. It looked as if it were wearing an old tattered black fur coat. It was hunched over in the middle of the road looking right at me. It stared at me as if it saw a human for the first time. "What are you?" I asked, with a frightened voice. It stared at me for a few more minutes and then said, "What are you?" in the same exact context and sound. My heart dropped as this thing took a step towards me. At this point, I was too scared to think of anything. This thing literally just repeated what I said in my own voice. It quickly kicked the bike into first gear, turned the bike back toward the road, and started riding. As I revved the throttle, it let out a blood-curdling, ear-piercing scream as I rode off. I caught myself watching back ever so often, making sure I wasn't being pursued. I made it home safe that night. But now, I never go out after midnight. Especially not on that road. If any of you have any idea what this could have been, please let me know. I've always loved the outdoors. History, mystery, adventure, and exploring. Where I live is the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia, an area steeping in long history. For the last 15 years, I've been learning about various undiscovered locations of interest. My personal focus being caves, chasms, and similar geological structures. I've spent hundreds of hours in the woods, both deep and shallow, hiked about 1,500 kilometers in search of such things, and in the end, I am successful for the most part. Around 2010, I read a spot in a book about two men finding a cave and artifacts along a river named Bloody Creek near Bridgetown. And after having read over the details of their find in the area, I took it upon myself to hunt this point of interest down, bag it, and tag it. So, I let the proper people know, and I set off. I grabbed my dollar store flashlight in case hauls out after dark, a bottle of Pepsi, and my walking pole, hopped into my car and drove along to where Bloody Creek passed under the highway. I parked and got out and started searching for what I might be some incredibly old relics of old local native or French origins, and thus began the first steps into a new world. I explored along the river, climbing down the embankment to river's side, through the trees and past a bunch of animal bones. I was going from the highway's edge and following the river to the south, checking behind any clumps of trees, rocks, and anywhere a cave might be found. Before I knew it, it started to get dark, so I started back towards my car, intending on just walking beside the creek, which was 20 feet wide, but shallow. Walking back, it became dark, and before I was halfway back, I started hearing splashes and something stepping on the rocks and scuttling off, as well as what sounded like a frog and a bird had kids, a croaky chirp. I figured it was raccoons or weasels or other critters coming out for nighttime activities, and kept on walking along, until the sounds of little feet and the bird-frog sound became too distant and close behind me. So I turned around, imagining some cute animal being curious. But since the flashlight was crap, all I seen were about a set of 5 eyes that reflected blue, white, and black, spaced wide apart and blinking over the edge of the rock. At first, I thought rabbits. I went to look closer, and whatever they were ran off into the dark. I went back to my car, kind of freaked out, because I needed a new flashlight for the next time I was going out there in a better parking spot. A few days later, about mid-September, I decided to go back looking again, a bit better with a high-powered spotlight, headlamp, and a hatchet for the branches in my way. Since I had better light, I had the idea in my head that I would go after with my wife when she got back from work. I had looked at maps and seen there was a road that ran closer to the spots that I wanted to be, so I could cut out a portion of the walk that wasn't much of interest and had animal bones and trees blocking the way. The new spot was just east of the creek, alongside a road that led to a gravel pit, and I had to walk along a dirt trail for a short distance before cutting through the tree line, past a pile of apples used to bait deer down a small hill, strewn with rocks and tree debris, and back beside the creek, not far from where I turned around the last time. This time I searched the riversides right up to the gravel pit before turning around as the darkness had fallen an hour before. The sound returned. I kept my lights low, intending on seeing what animal was following me, as I heard rabid animals follow people. Whatever it was, seemed to have become bold as I started walking towards the small hill to walk up past the apple pile to the trail, even leaving the side of the river where safety was. Something did not feel right. The pieces started coming together. Up until this time, let me tell you, I was an absolute skeptic and told anyone who mentioned Bigfoots and UFOs that they were a fucking idiot and should get checked, maybe even a lobotomy and neutered so they didn't pass on the stupid. I was an absolute skeptic prick. The pieces came together in such fashion. The croak chirps were exposed like words, like someone saying words but just in that weird sound. The footsteps sound that were like they were bipedal. The eyes were too round and far apart for any animal I know of. And besides, the light reflected didn't look normal. The final piece went into place when I turned around and let my full lights hit the area at the hill's bottom. These people were sneaking up behind me using rocks and tree debris as cover, but they were in full view now. Standing roughly 12 to 18 inches high, their skin was a dark brown, like rich wood. Their arms and legs were thin and long, attached to a shorter, athletic-looking body, but the heads were rounded and looked oversized for their bodies. The eyes were high up on the face and wide apart. The noses looked like chimpanzee noses. Those slits, sort of, and the mouth was wide as the head, with thick, rubbery-looking lips. They all had a gray, brown-colored hair that was shorter on the top of the head and grew into what looked like a cloak. But, looking closer, it was a longer hair that grew all the way down the back, attached to the back of the thighs and the back of the upper arms. After jacking the little bastards and getting a good look, I heard a snap of a twig behind me and turned to see another one on the hill, about 5 feet away, with a stick in its hands. It ran to hide behind a large tree. The others that were now behind me started walking and skittering towards me, making those sounds again. So I turned around again and watched them hide this time. Their coloration was almost perfect camouflage as they ducked and hid beside the trees and stones. Then realizing just what I'd stepped into, my blood ran cold. The apples were piled too close to a road to be a bait for a pile of deer. The small animal bones from roadkill around the small clumps of pine trees, the larger bones like deer jammed into rocks in random places. The little paths beside bones. I had wandered into their feeding ground. Those apples were a food gift, I would later learn. I somehow knew if I had tripped those little things, they would have swarmed all over me, popped my eyes out, and probably killed me with those sticks. They kept getting closer to me as I ascended the small hill. And when the sounds turned into shrill squeals of hate, I knew even at 200 pounds and 6 feet tall, these things would eat me alive. The fear hit me like a wave, and I ran as fast as I could, got in my car, and floored it out of there. On my way home, it finally hit me that I was wrong. Creatures exist, and for some reason, they are kept from the mainstream. My world had changed forever, and I am no longer a skeptic. But I just have no idea what those things could have been. I'm 28 now, but I was 8 or 9 at the time that was late spring. I left at 145 Conmere Avenue to St. Marie, Ontario, just opposite of Muddy, Michigan. My mom had just put me into bed around 9 p.m. and opened my window to cool off my room. I laid awake for the next few hours, tossing and turning. I was restless and felt uneasy. I opened my eyes to get up for a drink, but to my surprise, I saw a tall man in scraggly clothes, pacing back and forth by my bed, looking down at me. It was dark, but I could tell it was in the shape of a man. I pulled my blankets up to my nose and I was terrified. I was frozen, unable to make a sound and barely able to move. Just moving my blanket felt like I was lifting a sheet of wet cement. As he or it continued to pace, I could hear popping and crackling sounds, unlike anything I had ever heard before up to this point in my life. Suddenly, the eyes seemed to gain eye shine like a wild animal, and the legs began to bend and he grew tall, almost hissing its head on my ceiling. The face of this thing also began to distort. If you've seen the movie Hole, that's how the legs looked. And if you've seen the movie Howling, the face began to look like the creepy dude with the fur coat for the colony. As this thing continued to shapeshift, I began to cry. and as I began to yell, it started to reach out towards me. This stirred my mother, who woke up and began to get up and come to my room. The creature stopped reaching for me, looked over the shoulder, sneering. Then it quickly made its way to the window. It looked back at me, still transforming, and flashed me a toothy grin. It had jumped through the window out into my yard. My mother, thank goodness, came into my room and asked me what was wrong. As I frantically tried to explain what I saw, she chalked it up to too much sugar before bed. Even though she even stepped in the wet footprints left by the thing. She just figured the late rain must have picked up and come in the window. She didn't even bother to turn on the lights to see if it was footprints. She picked me up, and as I looked over her shoulder, I saw the thing. It fully changed outside in the yard. It now looked like the werewolves in the movie Dog Soldiers, which hadn't even been made at the time, but there it was, just staring back at me. Like it knew it could just still get me if it wanted to. I yelled and told my mum to look, but before she could see it, it ran off around the large 8-foot-tall fence in our yard into the brush between my house and my neighbours. She walked over and closed the window. She told me that monsters aren't real, but I knew it differently. Since this time, I began to ask my father about First Nation legends, and began looking into other belief systems that had shape-shifting lycanthropes. I'm now 28 and have researched a lot about werewolves, skinwalkers, berserkers, Loup-garou, and jaguar men, and all things of this nature. I've even begun looking into how to become one, like wearing a wolf skin belt or drinking from the paw print of a wolf on a full moon. I now have a bear and a wolf claw necklace, a wolf pellet I wear on occasion, full moons. And I've been trying to get an audience with my father's friend who is a chief up near Werpicule, First Nation reserves in the James Bay lowlands. But my father says he won't speak of such things, as he sees talking about them draws into you, and puts you and your family in danger.